Steven Spielberg has spent his career reshaping how we see war on the big screen. But here's the twist. While he made Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List, he still swears by a handful of war films that shaped him long before he was Hollywood's king. Some are blockbusters, others were made on shoestring budgets, and one is so pulpy you'd never expect it to be his all-time favorite. So, what films does Spielberg force his friends to sit through, year after year? Let's dive into the 10 war movies he says you absolutely need to see. Where Eagles Dare, 1968. It might surprise you, but Spielberg's all-time favorite war movie isn't some grim depiction of battlefield sacrifice. It's Where Eagles Dare. That's right. The over-the-top, pulpy 1968 spy thriller, often nicknamed the ultimate dad movie, tops his personal list. Why? Because sometimes war films don't have to be solemn. They can be roller coasters of chaos. The setup is pure, high-stakes madness. Richard Burton, playing an icy British intelligence officer, leads a ragtag crew on a mission to infiltrate a Nazi-controlled fortress perched high in the Bavarian Alps. Alongside him, a young Clint Eastwood, the token American whose trigger finger racks up the highest body count of his entire career. No joke, this film is Eastwood's record for most kills on screen. And it's not subtle. There are double crosses, triple crosses, endless reveals of who's really working for whom. And then, once the cards are on the table, the second half of the movie becomes wall-to-wall explosions, gunfights, and insane stunts. Burton himself admitted the idea came from Elizabeth Taylor's kids, who begged him to star in something fun for once. He delivered, and Spielberg never forgot it. In fact, he's quoted the film's famous line, "Broadsword calling Danny Boy," multiple times, cementing it as part of his own cinematic DNA. The line has even cropped up in unexpected places, from Doctor Who episodes to courtroom transcripts in the UK. For Burton, it was his last real US box office hit, the final exclamation point of a career that had been sliding downhill. But for Spielberg, it was something else entirely. Proof that war films could be entertaining, audacious, and unforgettable, without pretending to be realistic. That pulpy, exaggerated style is exactly what makes Where Eagles Dare stand out, and exactly why Spielberg calls it his favorite. The Zone of Interest, 2023. Spielberg shocked people when he called The Zone of Interest the best Holocaust film he'd seen since Schindler's List. That's a heavy endorsement, considering Schindler's List is arguably his most important work. But Jonathan Glazer's 2023 masterpiece earned that praise by taking an unconventional approach. Instead of showing battlefields or death camps directly, it lingers on the quiet, horrifying banality of life next door to Auschwitz. The story follows Rudolf Höss, the commandant of the camp, and his wife, Hedwig. On one side of the wall is industrial-scale human suffering. On the other, a picture-perfect family garden, picnics, children playing, and daily domestic routines. That's the genius and the horror of Glazer's vision. He shows us how ordinary life coexists with unimaginable evil, how comfort and atrocity can literally share a fence line. Spielberg praised the film's power to capture what Hannah Arendt once called the banality of evil. The Zone of Interest exploded after its premiere at Cannes, where it won the Grand Prix. It went on to gross over $52 million, a massive figure for such a stark arthouse film. It picked up 5 Oscar nominations, swept the BAFTAs, and generated controversy after Glazer's Oscar acceptance speech. Yet for all the awards chatter, what mattered most to Spielberg was its unflinching honesty. He recognized the film's daring choice, to refuse spectacle, to deny catharsis, and instead trap audiences in the unsettling mundanity of perpetrators' lives. Spielberg's approval carries serious weight. Remember, he doesn't hand out praise lightly when it comes to Holocaust depictions. He's fiercely protective of the subject after making Schindler's List. By calling The Zone of Interest a worthy successor, he was effectively passing the torch, acknowledging that Glazer captured something both new and profoundly necessary. In the end, Spielberg admires it because it's not about heroes or villains in the traditional sense. It's about people choosing not to see, people living comfortably while atrocities occur just beyond their backyard walls. And that's the kind of moral confrontation Spielberg believes cinema should force us into. Battleground, 1949. Before Spielberg was reshaping war cinema, he was just a kid glued to the TV, devouring old black and white films. One of the titles that never left him was Battleground. Released in 1949, it was the first major Hollywood combat film after World War II, and it changed how the genre was made. Spielberg would later call it one of the movies that most inspired him as a filmmaker. The film dramatizes the Battle of the Bulge, focusing on a squad of American soldiers trapped in Bastogne. What made it groundbreaking was its raw authenticity. Screenwriter Robert Pirro had fought in the battle himself as a master sergeant with the 35th Infantry Division. That experience translated into a script that refused easy heroics. MGM doubled down by recruiting 20 actual veterans from the 101st Airborne. They trained the actors and even appeared in the film as extras. That level of realism was virtually unheard of at the time. Audiences responded. Battleground became MGM's biggest hit in 5 years, winning 2 Oscars, including Best Screenplay. Critics praised it as gritty, serious, and respectful, proving that audiences were ready for war stories that didn't sugarcoat the experience. For Spielberg, it was a revelation. Watching those frozen, desperate men on screen left a permanent impression on him, shaping how he later approached Saving Private Ryan. What Spielberg admired most was that Battleground didn't romanticize war. It didn't show invincible heroes mowing down endless enemies. It showed hungry, exhausted soldiers doing their best to survive. It proved war could be portrayed with truth instead of gloss. And that kind of moral clarity was exactly what Spielberg carried into his own films decades later. For him, Battleground was proof that cinema could both honor the sacrifice of soldiers and reveal the human cost without needing to dress it up. It was the movie that convinced him war films could matter. The Steel Helmet, 1951. Spielberg has never hidden his admiration for Samuel Fuller, the cigar-chomping, battle-hardened director who turned his own combat experiences into films that pulled no punches. And of all Fuller's works, The Steel Helmet stands tallest in Spielberg's memory. Made in just 10 days on a shoestring budget of about $100,000, it was the first American film to tackle the Korean War head-on, and it rattled audiences when it premiered in 1951. What set it apart was its refusal to sanitize. Fuller had lived war. He'd stormed Normandy, liberated concentration camps, and been wounded in battle. So when he made The Steel Helmet, he filled it with the kind of grit and ugly truths Hollywood usually avoided. Soldiers execute prisoners. A Japanese-American G.I. talks about how his own family was locked up in internment camps. Racial tension crackles through the platoon. The movie didn't glorify. It stripped war bare. That honesty nearly got Fuller blacklisted. The FBI investigated him for supposed anti-American sentiment, and studio execs bristled at the idea of U.S. troops shown as flawed, vulnerable, and morally compromised. But audiences and future directors like Spielberg saw something else. A raw nerve of truth. Spielberg has openly called it one of the war films that shaped him most. And here's a fun Spielberg connection. The film introduces a character named Short Round, a nickname Fuller had picked up during his service. Decades later, Spielberg borrowed that name for Indy's pint-sized sidekick in Temple of Doom. That wasn't a coincidence. It was Spielberg tipping his hat to Fuller. For Spielberg, The Steel Helmet wasn't just a movie. It was a lesson in bravery, not battlefield bravery, but cinematic bravery. Fuller showed that even in the climate of McCarthy-era censorship, a director could tell the story as he saw it, unvarnished and uncompromised. And that courage is what Spielberg would carry into his own work. Hell is for Heroes, 1962. When people talk about Spielberg's inspirations, they usually name the big prestige classics. But tucked in his list is Hell is for Heroes, a lean, tense World War II film that gained cult status thanks to its star, Steve McQueen, and the messy chaos behind the scenes. Spielberg has repeatedly called this one an influence, proof that even flawed productions can leave a mark. The setup is straightforward. A small group of GIs, vastly outnumbered, are tasked with holding a line against the Germans. But while the story looks simple on paper, the production was anything but. McQueen, in peak difficult mode, constantly clashed with the crew. He fought with the director, ignored instructions, and drowned stress with heavy drinking. Robert Pirro, the Battleground screenwriter, was supposed to direct, but was quickly shoved aside after constant battles with McQueen. Don Siegel took over and steered the movie into darker territory, cutting most of Pirro's black comedy and leaning into bleak, unsparing drama. The budget didn't help. Midway through filming, it was slashed. The same patch of land had to double for every battle sequence. The crew reused German extras, sometimes killing the same soldier 3 or 4 times. Weapons jammed, props looked cheap, and they even ran out of film stock before they could shoot the ending. That abrupt finale, the soldiers left holding the line in uncertainty, wasn't planned. It was forced. Yet oddly enough, that unfinished quality gave the film a haunting resonance. Spielberg loved it for that rawness. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it felt real in a way slicker war movies didn't. And in McQueen's terse, simmering performance, he saw the kind of morally complex soldier he'd later put front and center in Saving Private Ryan. For Spielberg, Hell is for Heroes is proof that sometimes limitations create authenticity. War isn't clean or glamorous. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes it ends without resolution. Just like this movie, Paths of Glory, 1957. Spielberg has always been vocal about his admiration for Stanley Kubrick, and when it comes to war films, Paths of Glory is the one he holds up as a masterpiece. It's short, just 84 minutes, but it hits harder than most epics twice its length. For Spielberg, the film's emotional weight was summed up in a single scene. When Kubrick passed away, Spielberg honored him by screening the tavern sequence from Paths of Glory for a room full of guests. Just one scene. A German girl starts singing, and hardened French soldiers, beaten, humiliated, and shell-shocked, fall silent and begin to cry. Spielberg said, "We were all crying. The soldiers were crying. We were crying watching the soldiers cry." The story itself is brutal. Kirk Douglas stars as Colonel Dax, a French officer ordered to lead his men in a suicidal attack on a German stronghold known as the Anthill. When the mission inevitably fails, the generals refuse to take the blame. Instead, they accuse the soldiers of cowardice and put 3 of them on trial for their lives. The result is both a war movie and a courtroom drama, exposing the cruelty of military bureaucracy. France hated it. The film was banned there until 1975 because of its scathing depiction of French leadership. But Douglas called it the best performance of his career, and critics across the world hailed it as one of the greatest anti-war films ever made. Spielberg saw in it what he would later strive for himself: war not as glory, but as tragedy, futility, and moral collapse. For Spielberg, Paths of Glory showed that you don't need sweeping battle sequences to capture the truth of war. Sometimes, all it takes is a quiet song in a tavern to devastate an audience. Lawrence of Arabia, 1962. If there's one movie Spielberg talks about more than almost any other, it's Lawrence of Arabia. He's called it a miracle, described David Lean as his guru, and admitted it almost convinced him to quit filmmaking altogether. Why? Because the bar suddenly felt impossibly high. Spielberg first saw it as a teenager, projected in 70mm with booming stereo sound. He walked out of the theater in shock. wondering if he'd ever be good enough to compete with what he'd just witnessed. For weeks, he kept going back. He saw it once a week for a month, each time absorbing a little more of Lean's genius. By the end of that run, Spielberg had flipped. Instead of being intimidated, he was inspired. He said, "This is what I'm going to do, or I'm going to die trying." That's how much this film meant to him. And he doesn't just admire it privately. Spielberg screens Lawrence of Arabia every year and forces his friends to sit through the nearly 4-hour runtime with him. To him, it isn't just a war movie. It's an education in cinematic storytelling, scope, spectacle, moral ambiguity, and the way war reshapes identity. The film itself, of course, is monumental. Peter O'Toole's T.E. Lawrence is a man torn between cultures, trapped in the vast desert landscapes that become characters themselves. It's about war, but also about ego, politics, and the cost of becoming a legend. Spielberg loves it because it doesn't flinch from showing how war seduces and destroys at the same time. It's not about victory, it's about transformation, often the kind you can't come back from. For him, Lawrence of Arabia isn't just essential viewing. It's the film that made him who he is. The Best Years of Our Lives, 1946. Spielberg has often said that war films shouldn't just be about bullets and battlefields. They should be about what happens when the fighting stops. For him, no movie captures that better than The Best Years of Our Lives. Released in 1946, just months after World War II ended, it told a story America desperately needed to hear. The war might be over, but for the men who fought it, the struggle had only just begun. The film follows 3 servicemen returning home to small-town America. There's Fred, a decorated bombardier unable to find steady work. Al, a sergeant who becomes disillusioned with civilian life. And Homer, a sailor who lost both his hands and must now face the painful adjustment of returning to his fiancée. None of it is glamorous. There are no parades, no heroic speeches, just ordinary men wrestling with trauma, alienation, and the daunting question of how to move forward. Spielberg calls this one of the most honest films ever made about war. Not about the battles, but about the aftermath, the ripple effects on families, relationships, and entire communities. Tom Hanks once said, "It's the best film ever made about the war generation," and Spielberg agrees. He admires how director William Wyler, himself a veteran who flew combat missions, refused to sugarcoat reality. Audiences in 1946 responded with overwhelming emotion. The film became the highest-grossing release since Gone with the Wind and swept the Oscars, winning 7 awards, including Best Picture. Adjusted for inflation, it pulled in over $500 million. But for Spielberg, the numbers don't matter. What matters is its timeless relevance. Watch it today, and it still feels devastatingly true. For him, The Best Years of Our Lives is essential because it forces us to look beyond the battlefield and confront the hardest part of war: learning to live again. The Longest Day, 1962. Before Spielberg redefined D-Day in Saving Private Ryan, he studied The Longest Day. This sprawling, all-star epic was the definitive cinematic take on the Normandy invasion for decades, and Spielberg himself has cited it as essential viewing. Not because it's flawless, he actually thought its glossy spectacle needed fixing, but because it showed him both the possibilities and the limitations of telling such a massive story. Shot in black and white, with a budget that ballooned to $10 million, huge for the time, the film assembled a cast that was practically a who's who of the era: John Wayne, Henry Fonda, Richard Burton, Sean Connery, Robert Mitchum, and more. Each star played a role in the multi-perspective narrative, covering the invasion from the viewpoints of Americans, Brits, French resistance fighters, and even the Germans. What Spielberg admired was its ambition. Producer Darryl F. Zanuck was determined to make the definitive World War II epic, and he succeeded in creating a massive international production, even persuading military veterans to serve as advisors. But Spielberg also saw where it fell short. The sanitized violence and clear-cut heroics lacked the grit he knew veterans had lived through. It was inspiring, but too clean. That's why The Longest Day became both a model and a challenge for Spielberg. It showed him the importance of scope, but also the need for brutal honesty. When he finally made Saving Private Ryan, he intentionally designed the opening D-Day sequence as a corrective, shaky cameras, chaotic gore, and no star glamour. For Spielberg, The Longest Day isn't perfect, but it's vital. It gave him a foundation, something to push against, and ultimately, something to surpass. Schindler's List, 1993. It might feel like cheating to include one of his own films, but Spielberg himself insists Schindler's List is essential viewing for anyone who wants to understand war and its human cost. More than any of his other projects, this was the one that nearly broke him. Shot in stark black and white, with handheld cameras and little Hollywood gloss, the film tells the true story of Oskar Schindler, a Nazi businessman who saved more than 1,000 Jews during the Holocaust by employing them in his factories. Spielberg has admitted he didn't even want to make it at first. He tried to pass the project to directors like Martin Scorsese and Roman Polanski, doubting whether he had the maturity to handle the subject. But eventually, he realized he had no choice. This was his responsibility, and the result was a film so powerful, it changed him forever. He refused a paycheck for the movie, calling any profit blood money. He filmed on location in Poland, just miles from Auschwitz. He leaned on survivors for guidance. The experience left him emotionally drained, so much so that he would spend nights calling Robin Williams for comic relief just to cope. The impact was staggering. Schindler's List won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, and is widely regarded as one of the most important films ever made. But for Spielberg, the real legacy isn't awards, it's education. He founded the Shoah Foundation to preserve Holocaust testimonies, ensuring future generations would never forget. Spielberg once said, "This was not a movie. It was something that happened for him. Schindler's List is not optional. It's a moral imperative." From pulpy thrill rides like Where Eagles Dare to soul-shattering dramas like Schindler's List, Spielberg's war movie canon is as diverse as it is uncompromising. These aren't just films he likes. They're films that shaped him, challenged him, and, in some cases, nearly stopped him in his tracks. And now, they're the movies he wants you to see. So, which of these war classics have you watched, and which ones are going straight onto your list? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into cinema history. And remember, sometimes the truth of war isn't found on the battlefield, but in the stories we tell afterward.